Imagine an HOA so greedy. They tried to claim a private lake that had been in my family for generations. They built 139 cabins on land they didn't own, threw parties on my shoreline, and demanded I hand over the dam itself. But what they didn't realize is that the dam was the only thing keeping their empire from washing away. The Lackett Lake had been my family's sanctuary for generations. It was not just water and shoreline. It was history carved into the land, passed down through time. My grandfather had built the dam by hand, stone by stone, in an era when neighbors worked together. And land was more than property, it was livelihood. That dam turned a trickle of a river into a wide, deep lake, a place where fish thrived, where ducks nested, and where summer afternoons seemed endless. It was ours, and ours alone. When I inherited it, I swore to protect it. The dam, the water, the forested slopes around it, they were not just resources, they were memories. I kept the land open to friends and family, allowing fishing and camping, but never to developers. To outsiders, the lake looked like untapped potential. To me, it was a sacred trust. For years, no one challenged me. Developers sniffed around, but the land deed was ironclad. The dam was mine, the water mine, and the shoreline that stretched out for miles was under my care. I thought that meant safety. I thought it meant permanence. I was wrong. The threat didn't come from strangers with glossy brochures or businessmen in suits. It came from people much closer, people who believed themselves entitled to everything they could lay their hands on. The local homeowners association. They had long eyed my property, claiming the lake was under their community jurisdiction, even though their neighborhood ended half a mile from the water line. At first, their claims were laughable. They sent letters, each one signed with the pompous authority of their board, demanding access to community resources. I ignored them. But HOA letters, once denied, never retreat. They escalate. It began subtly, neighbors wandering down to the shoreline, leaving behind trash. Then came boats launched without permission, parties spilling out onto the banks, and fishermen who ignored my warnings. When I confronted them, they pointed to their HOA membership cards like they were government-issued badges. The tipping point came when trucks rolled in. At first, I thought it was another trespassing group, maybe campers looking for a place to set up. But these weren't campers, they were contractors. Bulldozers churned the soil, stakes marked the ground, and before long, foundations began to rise. The HOA wasn't just trespassing anymore. They were building vacation cabins, they called them, one after another, sprouting like weeds along the lakefront, lining the shore I had fought to preserve. It wasn't one or two cabins, it was an entire development. 139 structures planned, each one advertised as a private retreat for HOA members only. They advertised the lake as theirs, promising summer getaways, water sports, and a paradise that had never belonged to them. My protests went unheard. I showed the deeds, the maps, the history. They laughed. They claimed community right-of-way, citing bylaws that had no authority on my land. They filed lawsuits, not to prove ownership, but to drown me in legal fees. And as the cabins multiplied, so did the damage. The shoreline eroded under their construction. Trees that had stood for decades were felled. Waste seeped into the water, clouding what had once been crystal clear. I walked the dam each night, feeling its age under my boots. My grandfather's work had endured storms, droughts, and decades of time. But I wondered if it could endure this. The HOA didn't care about the lake, they cared about profits, about control, about building their kingdom on ground they didn't own. And for the first time in my life, I felt powerless. Weeks turned into months. The cabins rose quickly, too quickly, until they dotted the shoreline like a scar. Tourists began arriving. Members of the HOA who believed their dues bought them the right to vacation on my family's land. They drove jet skis across the water, scaring off wildlife. They lit bonfires that left the air heavy with smoke. The peace of the lake was gone, replaced by noise and greed. And yet, the HOA still wasn't satisfied. They wanted docks, piers, boat rentals. They wanted the dam itself, demanding I surrender it so they could manage water levels for community safety. That was the final straw. The dam was the heart of it all. Without it, there was no lake, no cabins, no empire for the HOA to claim. They believed it was theirs for the taking. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. As I stood on the dam one evening, watching the sun sink behind the cabins that lined my family's shore, I realized I had been patient for too long. They had built their kingdom on stolen land, and kingdoms built on theft never last. I didn't need lawyers. I didn't need permission. I had the power to end it all with the turn of a wheel, and when I did, nature itself would take care of the rest. The planned decision weighed heavily on me, yet it also felt inevitable. The HOA had pushed me to the brink, and there was no compromise left to make. Every letter they sent, every cabin they erected, every tree they cut down was another nail in the coffin of the place my family had preserved for generations. They had treated the lake as their playground, never once considering its history, its fragility, or the fact that it was never theirs to begin with. The dam was old, but it was sturdy. Built of stone and reinforced with steel beams, it had held back the river for nearly a century. Its gates could be opened to release pressure in times of flood, but they were always carefully controlled. My grandfather had designed them to be both practical and powerful, capable of draining the lake within hours if necessary. He had built them with respect for the land, but I was beginning to see their other potential. The HOA believed their cabins were safe. They built them low to the shore, advertising direct water access and stunning lakeside views. They had never considered what would happen if the lake vanished, if the water levels dropped suddenly, or worse, if the floodgates opened wide. To them, the dam was background scenery, a quaint relic. To me, it was a weapon. I began visiting the dam more frequently, studying it the way a soldier studies his arsenal. I checked the mechanisms, oiled the gears, and tested the locks. I knew the day was coming when I would need to act, and when it came, I could not afford a single hesitation, but patience was required. If I struck too soon, they could rebuild. If I lashed out without preparation, I could be blamed and held accountable. I needed to time it perfectly, to let their arrogance reach its peak before tearing it all down. In the meantime, I played the role of the defeated landowner. When they sent me letters, I ignored them. When they staged their board meetings, I stayed away. They thought they had won. They mistook my silence for surrender, not realizing it was the calm before the storm. And as they built, I gathered information. I walked the shoreline under cover of darkness, counting cabins, noting their weaknesses. Some were perched on fragile ground, others too close to the waterline. I noticed where their waste drained into the lake, where their docks reached too far, and where their foundations seemed flimsy. Each detail mattered. I also watched the weather. Summer was fading, and with it came storms. The river that fed the lake would swell with autumn rains, and the water pressure behind the dam would rise. The cabins, so carelessly placed, would be most vulnerable then. If the gates opened at the right time, the flood wouldn't just drain the lake, it would unleash it, sweeping away everything in its path. The more I planned, the clearer my resolve became. This wasn't vengeance for its own sake. It was restoration. They had stolen something sacred, desecrated it with their greed, and nature itself would take it back. I would simply guide the process. Still, I knew the risks. Once the dam was opened, there would be no undoing it. The cabins would be destroyed, yes, but so too would the peace I had known. There would be investigations, questions, accusations. But even if they dragged me into court, I had the truth on my side. The land was mine. The dam was mine. And if I chose to release the water, that was within my rights. Weeks passed. The cabins multiplied until the shoreline looked like a subdivision. Trucks rumbled down the dirt roads daily, unloading supplies, furniture, and equipment. The HOA bragged in their newsletters about the crown jewel of their community, boasting of record high membership dues and vacation bookings. Their arrogance was breathtaking. The final straw came when I received their newest demand in the mail. The HOA was now requiring me to relinquish all rights to the dam. They called it community management of natural resources, but I knew the truth. They wanted control, and once they had it, the lake would never again belong to me. That letter sealed their fate. I burned it in my fireplace, watching the flames devour their arrogance. Then I walked to the dam one last time before the storm season began. I stood on the stone wall, feeling the cool spray of water rising from the spillway below. The gates loomed before me, heavy, waiting. I placed my hand on the iron wheel, feeling its weight, its promise. Soon, very soon, it would turn. But not tonight. Timing was everything. I would wait until the storm swelled the lake to its highest point, until the cabins were full of unsuspecting vacationers, until the HOA believed they had truly conquered what was mine. Only then would I open the gates and let nature do what it was always meant to do. The countdown had begun. The storm came. Earlier than expected. Dark clouds rolled over the horizon, heavy with rain, turning the skies into a churning sea of gray. The wind swept across the lake, rippling the water into restless waves. To most, it was a warning. To me, it was an opportunity. Nature itself was aligning with my plan, amplifying the power of the dam, feeding the river, and swelling the reservoir beyond its usual calm. For days the rain poured without mercy. The lake grew restless, rising higher with every passing hour. The old dam creaked under the strain, but I knew its strength. My grandfather had built it to withstand forces greater than this, and for years it had proven unbreakable. But the cabins lining the shoreline were not so resilient. Their foundations shifted in the mud. Their walls warped from the damp. I watched from my porch as water lapped dangerously close to their decks, creeping higher, threatening to swallow them even before the gates were touched. Yet the HOA remained blind. To them, the storm was nothing more than a test of endurance, something to weather while basking in their supposed victory. Their board president, a woman with a voice sharp enough to cut glass, bragged openly at their gathering that the lake was theirs now, that the cabins would stand for generations, and that no one could take them away. She couldn't see that the storm itself was already unraveling her empire. I waited, patient as ever, watching and listening. Trucks came less frequently now, unable to navigate the flooded dirt roads. Vacationers, however, arrived in droves. The HOA had advertised storm season discounts, selling the cabins as cozy retreats where families could gather around fireplaces and watch the rain. The irony was almost laughable. They were filling the cabins to capacity at the very moment they should have been emptying them. The more they gathered, the more resolute I became. It wasn't just about restoring the lake anymore. It was about showing them the consequences of their arrogance. They had taken what wasn't theirs, destroyed what they didn't understand, and mocked the one person who had the power to stop them. Now, nature would become their judge each day. I walked the dam. The sound of water roaring through the spillway grew louder, deeper, like a beast straining against its chains. I checked the gates, tested the wheel, and reassured myself that when the time came, everything would work as it should. My hands had memorized every groove of the mechanism, every resistance point, every click of the lock dot, and as the storm raged on, I made my preparations. I stored supplies in my cabin, knowing I would need to stay put once the flood began. I cleared a path to higher ground, ensuring I would be safe when the water roared free. I even packed away old photographs, journals, and artifacts from my grandfather, things too valuable to risk, in case the aftermath brought more chaos than I anticipated. On the fourth night of the storm, I walked down to the shoreline, blending with the crowd of vacationers. They drank and laughed, treating the rising waters as little more than a backdrop for their entertainment. Children splashed in the shallows where tree roots now disappeared beneath the lake. Music thumped from portable speakers. They toasted their success as if nothing could touch them. None of them noticed me. To them, I was a nobody, a recluse whose land had been absorbed by the HOA's vision. They didn't realize they were celebrating on my family's graveyard. They didn't see that the very man they had stolen from was standing among them, listening, memorizing their arrogance, waiting for the moment to end it all. That night, as thunder cracked overhead and lightning split the sky, I returned to the dam one final time before the act itself. The water level had risen to its peak, churning against the gates with a violence I had never seen before. The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that drowned out even the storm. The power behind those gates was unimaginable. I placed my hand on the wheel again, and this time, I could feel the vibration of the lake itself, trembling with impatience. It was ready. All it needed was me, but not yet. The cabins were still filling. The HOA still believed themselves untouchable. I wanted them at their highest point of confidence, their empire full, their victory total. Only then would the fall truly break them. So I walked away, back to my cabin, and waited. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The dam strained under the weight, but it would hold until I decided otherwise. The timing had to be perfect, and when it was, the lake would no longer be theirs. It would return to me. The celebration they storm still raged, but to the HOA, it was nothing more than ambience. The cabins were full now, each one occupied by families who believed they were part of something special, something exclusive. The association had turned the swelling lake into a marketing tool, boasting about waterfront views at their most dramatic, and selling it as a once-in-a-lifetime getaway. That weekend, they staged their grand celebration. It wasn't enough for them to build 139 cabins. They had to flaunt them, to parade their supposed triumph over me and the land itself. They strung lights along the shoreline, casting a golden glow across the restless water. Tents were erected, grills fired up, and music blared across the valley. They called it the Lakefront Gala. The event meant to cement their ownership of the place my family had preserved for generations. I watched from the shadows of the trees, unseen but ever present. They had gathered in their finest clothes, HOA board members boasting and clinking glasses, their laughter rising above the thunder in the distance. Children darted between the cabins, their parents too busy gloating to notice how close they played to the swollen water line. The board president stood at the center, her voice amplified by microphones, declaring the cabins a permanent jewel of the community. Every word was arrogance. Every smile, every toast, every step they took across my land was fuel for what was to come. They thought they had won. They thought I was defeated, broken, irrelevant. What they didn't realize was that the very ground beneath them was borrowed. The lake they claimed was restrained only by my will. The storm built its fury as they celebrated. Rain poured in sheets, soaking the lights strung across the shoreline. The music wavered as speakers sputtered under the deluge. The mud thickened under their feet, clinging to their expensive shoes. Yet they continued, laughing through it all, determined to show that nothing, not even the elements, could threaten their victory. But I knew better. Behind them, the lake swelled higher still, licking at the edges of decks, tugging at pilings, wrapping itself around the foundations of cabins that had no business being there. The dam strained against its burden, its gates groaning as though pleading to be released. I could feel it from where I stood, a vibration in the earth, a call to action. I left the shadows and returned to the dam. The path was slick with mud, branches whipping at me in the wind, but I moved with certainty. Each step brought me closer to the decision I had been preparing for. I carried a lantern to light the way, though the lightning overhead did much of the work, flashing across the sky in jagged bursts that illuminated the ancient stonework of the dam. When I reached it, the roar of water was overwhelming. It thundered in my chest, rattled my bones, and drowned out every thought except one. It was time. The cabins were full, the HOA was distracted, and the storm had done its part. There would never be a more perfect moment. I stood before the gate wheel, rain soaking me to the skin, my hand trembling as I reached for it. This was the culmination of everything: their arrogance, their theft, their destruction of what was never theirs. All of it would end here. I thought of my grandfather, of the stone he had set, of the sweat he had poured into every inch of the dam. I thought of the lake as it had been, clear and quiet, before the cabins scarred its edges. I thought of the future, of what might rise again once the water had reclaimed what was stolen. I turned the wheel. At first, nothing happened. The rusted mechanism resisted, as though testing my resolve. Then, with a groan, it shifted. The gate creaked open, and the first surge of water rushed through, white and violent, roaring into the riverbed below. The dam shuddered, alive now, the beast unchained. I turned it further. The gate opened wider, and the lake answered. Water poured forth in a torrent, rushing into the valley, gaining speed and force with every second. The sound was deafening, a primal scream that shook the night. Back at the cabins, the celebration faltered. I could see lights flickering as power surged. Voices rose in confusion, laughter turning to shouts. Some pointed toward the lake, realizing too late that the water was not just rising, it was moving. The flood had begun. The cabins, built too close to the shoreline, had no defense. Decks splintered under the sudden force. Docks tore free, swept into the current like matchsticks. Foundations cracked as the earth beneath them gave way. The gala dissolved into chaos, screams cutting through the storm as families scrambled to escape. I watched from the dam, rain lashing against my face, lantern flickering in the wind. The HOA's kingdom was crumbling before my eyes, not by my hand alone, but by the power of nature itself. The water was reclaiming what was stolen, erasing their arrogance in a single, unstoppable surge. And yet, I felt no guilt, only justice. The storm raged on, the floodwaters rising higher, sweeping across the valley. Cabins crumbled, one after another, until the shoreline was nothing but debris and swirling water. The HOA's dream had become a nightmare. Their empire washed away in a matter of moments, and I stood at the center of it all, the keeper of the dam, the last heir of the lake, watching as the land finally took back what was always its own. The aftermath be morning. The storm had passed. The thunder faded into distant rumbles, the lightning reduced to faint flickers on the horizon. What remained was silence, heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the sound of water still rushing through the open gates of the dam. The lake I had known all my life was gone. In its place lay a vast, muddy basin, the cracked skeleton of its former glory. The shoreline, once lush and alive, was now a wasteland of debris, and the cabins, they were no more. Where 139 proud structures had stood the day before, there was nothing but ruin. Some had been swept entirely into the valley below, shattered and carried downstream like driftwood. Others clung stubbornly to their foundations, tilted and broken, their walls caved in, their roofs peeled away. Decks and docks floated aimlessly in the receding water, tangled with tree branches and shattered furniture. The gala tents were shredded, their poles bent like twigs. The HOA's jewel, their crown achievement, had been erased in a single night. I stood at the dam, surveying it all. The air smelled of mud and wet ash. The lantern I had carried hours before now sat extinguished at my feet, its glass cracked, forgotten. My clothes clung to me, heavy with the memory of rain. The silence pressed in on me, but beneath it was something else, relief. For the first time in months, the lake was mine again. Not as it had been, no. It would take years for the water to refill, for the shoreline to heal, for the forest to grow back. But it was free. The cabins were gone, their scar on the land erased by the very forces the HOA had thought they controlled. Justice had been delivered, swift and merciless. Down below, the chaos lingered. Families staggered through the mud, covered in grime, carrying what little they could salvage. Cars stuck in the muck lined the dirt road, their tires buried to the axles. HOA board members shouted orders, their voices shrill, their authority hollow. No one listened. The empire they had built on stolen ground had crumbled, and with it went their power. News of the disaster spread quickly. By midday, county officials had arrived, their vehicles struggling through the ruined roads. They took photographs, asked questions, shook their heads at the destruction. The HOA tried to shift the blame onto me, insisting the dam's release was intentional. They screamed about sabotage, about vengeance, about the landowner who had always resisted progress. But the truth was more complicated, and everyone knew it. The storm had been relentless, the cabins were built too close, and the HOA had ignored every warning. Even if they suspected my hand in the destruction, proving it would be near impossible. On paper, the floodgates had functioned as designed, releasing water to prevent the dam from bursting. Any argument beyond that was nothing more than speculation. I stayed silent through it all. I gave no interviews, filed no reports, offered no explanations. I remained the quiet figure in the background, the recluse whose land had been abused and who now watched it heal. The HOA could scream as much as they wanted, but their credibility was gone. Their cabins were illegal from the start, their construction unauthorized, their empire a fraud. Now it lay in ruins, exposed for what it had always been. As the sun set that evening, the silence deepened once again. The storm clouds broke apart, revealing streaks of orange and pink across the sky. I walked along the shoreline, now nothing but mud and wreckage, and felt the weight of it all settle on me. The deed was done. The lake had spoken. But justice, I realized, was not always clean. Families had lost possessions, perhaps more. Children had cried as their parents dragged them through the mud. Even though the cabins never should have been built, they had been filled with people. And people had suffered. The HOA board had created this disaster, but the collateral damage was real. Still, I felt no regret. What alternative had there been? Lawsuits, courts, endless battles that would have drained me dry while the cabins multiplied? No, this was the only way, the final way. And though it came at a cost, the land was free again. The HOA would rebuild their lives elsewhere. I knew, but they would never rebuild here. The dam had seen to that. Just as weeks passed, and the ruins of the cabins remained as a reminder of what had happened. The once proud shoreline was littered with collapsed beams, broken furniture, and fragments of walls. What the flood hadn't carried away now stood rotting in the sun, a monument to greed and arrogance. Nature had stripped the HOA of its triumph, leaving them nothing but mud and memories. The news spread far beyond the valley. Headlines called it a disaster, a tragedy of poor planning, a lesson in unchecked development. Reporters flocked to the scene, cameras lingering on the wreckage, capturing the hollow faces of the HOA board members as they struggled to spin the story. They blamed the storm. They blamed faulty construction. They even tried, in their most desperate moments, to blame me. But the public wasn't convinced. The truth was clear enough to anyone who cared to look. The HOA had overstepped. They had built where they had no right to build, ignored warnings, and placed their members directly in harm's way. Their arrogance had been their undoing, and no amount of finger-pointing could change that. Investigations followed. County inspectors reviewed every permit, every deed, every contract. One by one, the lies unraveled. The HOA had falsified documents, pressured officials, and built illegally on private property. What they had created was not only a moral trespass but a legal one. And as the evidence mounted, their empire collapsed. Board members resigned in disgrace. Lawsuits piled up against them, not from me, but from their own members' families who had lost money, property, and trust. The HOAS accounts were drained to pay settlements, and within months, the association that had once lorded over the neighborhood with smug authority was dissolved. Through it all, I remained silent. I didn't celebrate publicly, didn't gloat or point fingers. I simply watched as justice unfolded in its own way. The land had spoken, and now the law followed. The cabins were never rebuilt. The wreckage was eventually cleared, hauled away by contractors under court order. What remained was scarred earth, but even scars healed by the following spring. Green shoots began to push through the mud. Wildflowers spread across the open spaces where foundations once stood. Birds returned to nest in the trees along the shore. Fish filled the streams again, their paths no longer blocked by runoff and waste. Slowly, the lake began to refill, fed by the same river my grandfather had once tamed. I walked the shoreline often, boots sinking into the damp earth, watching the progress. Each day the land looked a little more like it had before, a little more like the place my family had preserved for generations. The cabins were gone, the noise was gone, and with them went the shadow that had hung over the lake. Sometimes I thought of the families who had been swept up in it, all those who had paid their dues to the HOA, trusting in promises that turned to lies. They had been pawns in a larger game, victims of greed disguised as community. But I knew they would recover. People always did, and perhaps in their own way. They had learned something too, never to place blind faith in those who build on foundations of arrogance. As for me, I returned to my quiet life. The dam still stood, its gates repaired and watched carefully. It remained what it had always been, a tool, a guardian, a reminder of the power of restraint. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The lesson had already been written into history, carved into the valley itself. The HOA had come with power and pride. They had believed themselves untouchable, above the law, above the land, above me. They thought they could take what was never theirs and make it permanent. But permanence belongs only to nature. The lake was never theirs. It was mine and always would be. And the next time anyone tried to claim it, all I would need to do was point to the valley, to the empty scars where 139 cabins once stood, and remind them of what happens when greed forgets who truly holds the power. Give me 20 image prompt scene by scene.